class. Okay, we're going to talk a little bit about the quadrants for equity for exemplary teaching. And this is an important, I think, and very useful tool, not only for teachers, but really for anybody who works with the public. And if they are in any way serving people who come from diverse backgrounds, diverse in the sense that they may be outside of the white middle class norm, which is mainstream US society. So let me share my screen with you and just talk you through this. You should have your own copy of this so that you're looking at what I'm looking at, but I'll put it up here just for you as well. Okay, so with these equity quadrants, we're looking at different points of view. And the first column here is called dominant mainstream groups. We're looking as if we're putting on a pair of glasses and we're looking at the world through these dominant mainstream glasses. What do we see when we put these glasses on? And then we're going to look also at a different pair of glasses, put a different pair of glasses on. And this pair of glasses is going to be our minoritized oppressed groups pair of glasses. It's always different depending on which group you are situated in. Okay. And then down the column here, down the side, we're going to look at, from the dominant group's perspective, what is the nature of schools and society? And then from the dominant perspective, what is the nature of minoritized groups at school and within society? And then changing our glasses, putting on our other glasses, what is the nature of schools and society from their perspective? And then how do they see minoritized groups and at school and within society? Okay, so we're putting on different pairs of glasses. We're not saying we actually believe these things, but what we're saying is we're trying to look at it from that perspective, from those patterns of thinking about the world around us. What do we see? So we'll start right here with the dominant group, mainstream groups glasses. So when we put on these pair of glasses, this is our white middle class, primary English speaking, Protestant Christian, heterosexual, privileging male mainstream. Okay. And so if I use those glasses, the white mainstream glasses, how do I see schools and society? Well, I look at schools and society as kind of, I think about, well, why were schools founded in the first place with the Common Schools movement? They were supposed to be about rags to riches stories, right? That was the whole idea. Thomas Jefferson was talking about that. Well, if we're going to have a republic and citizens in the republic need to be informed, well, we got to level the playing field, right? We need to level the playing field. Level the playing field. I'm sure you've heard that before. So no matter what your background is, if we level the playing field, it means that everybody's going to have a fair shot. So that's a key word: fair, equal, open. So how do we see when, now remember, we have our dominant mainstream glasses on here. How do we see schools and society? We see them as open, as fair, as equal. Okay, if we think about the United States, even the highest office in the land, the US president, Our society is open because we've even had a Black president. We haven't had a woman president yet, but a woman came very close to winning the presidency, not in this most recent election, but the one previous to it. So we almost had a woman president. And so that was a fair competition, right? There were votes cast. It was open, it was equal, it was fair. Anyone could be president. Anyone could be a doctor. Anyone could be a pilot, right? Our society and our schools and our institutions are fair and open and equal. That's from the mainstream dominant group's perspective, right? So if we think about, this true story, I was born in Upper Michigan, up by the Canadian border, in a poor family with a dad who was a truck driver. My parents had very little education. And then I went to school, became a college graduate. Then I became a college graduate again and again, and I ended up just climbing the ladder because, even poor kids can go to college, right? Our schools are open and fair. So that from the dominant perspective, our schools are open, fair, equal. If you just work hard, so we'll put work hard and merit. You have to merit the rewards that you earn. So you don't just get a diploma, you have to work for it, right? But anyone could get it because it's open and fair. We don't have any more signs anymore, right? We used to, so no more signs of exclusion. We used to have those in the United States. It would be pretty common anywhere you went. It might be over a drinking fountain, and here, trigger warning, over a drinking fountain, it might say for whites only, and then the other fountain might say for coloreds, trigger warning. We don't use that kind of language anymore. And we used to have signs that would say no dogs, no Mexicans. We used to have those kind of signs, but we don't anymore, right? So our schools and our society is open now. It's open, it's fair. If you do the hard work, you'll get there. Okay. So that's the nature from the dominant perspective. Okay, so from the dominant perspective here with the nature of minoritized groups, we're still looking at the dominant perspective here. We still got that mainstream white middle class primary English speaking perspective, which is important because that's the perspective that most of our teachers come from. If we look at the teaching profession, it is overwhelmingly white. It is overwhelmingly women. It's overwhelmingly primary English speakers who are of Protestant Christian persuasion if they have a religious affiliation. So this dominant perspective is very important. So from the dominant perspective, what is the nature of minoritized groups at school and within society? Okay, so we have this issue here in the United States. We have a fundamental problem because our society cares very much about equality, right? In our founding narratives, with the founding of our nation, you have a lot of language that's called, that's about equality. And there's a lot of talk about in our founding documents, all men are created equal. And of course, they did mean literally men, but we're going to put humans, all humans are created equal. Because the founding fathers, they did mean men, white men, but they also had a specific group of white men, not just any white men, but you had to be a property owning white man. So when they said all men were created equal, they weren't talking about women, they weren't talking about indigenous people, they weren't talking about certainly not Black people, they weren't talking about a whole bunch of people, but they were talking about land owning white men. So we're going to change that to all humans are created. I think from the dominant perspective now, most people would tell you that, yeah, it's not just landowning white men, but that human beings are all created equal. So we have this big narrative in the United States about people being equal and having equal worth. And so they need equal opportunity, right? So we believe strongly in that in our society. But if we look around in the United States, we have this problem because, and we've always had this problem, where we have this big value and we talk about it and we tell stories about it and we think about ourselves as a nation, as a people, as a group. We have these stories about equality and freedom and liberty and justice, right? Doesn't that sound like us in the United States? That's our whole like historical narrative. We have that about the stories we tell. 4th of July comes around, you hear a lot more talk about that because these are the stories that we tell about ourselves, how we understand ourselves. Okay, so we have that, but what do we also have? We have a problem, because if you look around you and you really look around you, you can see that we have a lot of inequality. So in our surroundings. So we talk about, we have these ideals of equality, but then if you look around, let me just minimize this a little bit. If you look around, you're going to see, even though we talk about all men are created equal, it's been a problem like since our earliest days, right? Even if you read the early founding documents of the nation, and you see that Black people were not even considered full human beings, you'll also see how like American Indians are talked about. So we've had these issues and it hasn't gone unnoticed. And it didn't go unnoticed in the past that we talked about freedom, but we had a lot of unfreedom. And then with the Trail of Tears, the westward movement was actually going eastward for a lot of indigenous people. And some people that were being carried westward were not going because they wanted to, but because they were captives and they were chattel slavery and they were enslaved and they were taken west. So our story is a little bit more complicated than our ideals maybe suggest. And even if we look around today, we've got this problem because we look around and we go, where do you see, look at our professions, our high status professions, which are the professions that make a lot of money, that have a lot of prestige. They'll often be associated with STEM, right? And those are not really pink collar jobs that are associated with women. And so, you start seeing this inequity there, and you're starting to see sometimes some women are still, they're breaking these glass ceilings and they're pushing up. And so you are starting to see women be CEOs, and you are seeing women becoming tenured professors, and they're moving out of just the pink colored ones of nursing and teaching and secretaries, And then you see Black people too. We even had a Black president, where it used to be your options. If you were Black, you could teach or you could preach. But now you start seeing many more opportunities. So we have a lot of inequality. We've seen some gains for sure, but nevertheless, we still look around in our professions and we see, wow, the teaching force is overwhelmingly white. Wow, the medical field is very, very white. And they will tell you that. Because they're doing explicit efforts to start bringing in more diversity in their ranks. And you wouldn't need to do that if you already had a lot of diverse people in your ranks. So we too, in education, we're always trying to recruit and trying to diversify our white teaching population. So we have some inequalities. And if we look at our universities and our prisons, you will see that our prisons are about the inverse of our universities. So if our universities are overwhelmingly white, our prisons are overwhelmingly Black and Latino. And what's so problematic about that is that if you look at the ratio of the populations, there's the Black people are a quite small percentage of the total population, but they are a very large population in prisons. So the ratios are very distorted. So clearly we have a lot of inequality. If you look at our cities and you look at who lives in the more elite areas and who lives in the more impoverished areas, you will often see a color line there as well. If you live in Salt Lake City, you might kind of understand the west side and the east side, and you know that there's a lot more racial diversity on the west side, even though it's not totally white on the east side. That there's like a color line, and we have that even where I live in Mobile, Alabama. We have a very elite kind of old money area in the city, and that's very white. It's not totally white, but it's very white. And then you have a very, very poor area of the city, which is like 99% Black. And so my point being that you have all of this inequality around you, and you look around, and again, from the dominant perspective, this is a problem for a country that says that it's about equality. If we didn't say we weren't about that, we were about equality, it wouldn't be an issue. But when you walk around saying, well, all men are created equal, all human beings are created equal, it's a problem when people look around, they're like, you just said that everybody's created equal and should have an equal opportunity, but how come your prisons look that color and your universities look that color? How come your housing looks this way, and how come your healthcare and who pays the highest prices for the consequences of the pandemic? That was definitely disproportionately carried by people in society, right? So we have a lot of inequality in our lived experience around us. You can see it. So the point being here now, how do we explain it? So how do we explain inequality in a society that claims or proclaims equality from the dominant perspective? We got to explain it, right? If we didn't say a word about equality, we wouldn't have to explain it. But since our whole identity as a nation is grounded in this issue of freedom, liberty, justice, equality, you know, we set ourselves up for this problem where we have to explain the inequality that's around us. So from the dominant perspective, put your dominant glasses back on. How does that get explained? We have this paradox, if you will, of equality being a value, but inequality being clearly around us everywhere we look. If it didn't, we wouldn't have to have people who run around, you know, and have to organize each other and say Black Lives Matter, you know, carry signs that say that, or put on hats that say "Me Too," you know, things like that. You wouldn't need those if you didn't have all this inequality. So how do we explain that from the dominant perspective? Our dominant perspective, put those glasses on. How do we explain that? How do we explain it? Well, how have you heard it explained? Maybe you've heard it like I have. People will say, well, minorities don't care. Now, I'm not saying you believe this. I'm saying that this is what people say. This is the people say. I've heard it said. Minorities don't care about education. I'm gonna put that in quotes. I hear that. I'm not saying you believe that. I'm not saying I believe it. That's from the dominant perspective that you hear that. How come we have our prisons are so black and so brown and our universities are so white? How do you explain it? Well, I'm gonna put they, which means minoritized people, they don't care about education. They, the royal they, don't raise their children right or well, right? They don't parent well. Okay. What else can we say here? They aren't motivated. Have you heard that? They're not motivated. So you hear all of these different things about, well, why do we have these inequalities? Why do they exist? You start pointing fingers at them, right? If you came to my city here in Mobile, Alabama, and you walked from one part of the city to another part and you say, wow, this part of the city here looks so impoverished, and some of the homes don't even have running water. This is 2022. How is this possible? And you might say, wow, their yards are such a wreck. You know, they don't bother cutting the grass. They don't bother trimming the hedges. Their paint needs redone. Their roof looks bad. So you might say, well, maybe they don't know. They don't know how to do it. They just don't know things, or they don't care, or they aren't motivated. Maybe they're lazy, you know, right? Why does it look that way? You know, if you were here in my city, then you might say, well, how is it that people in the wealthiest country in the world live in these kind of conditions? You know, would you start picketing? Would you start, you know, get on your cell phone and call up the mayor and say, how do you let these US citizens live like this? This is the wealthiest country in the world. This is not right that people in the United States live like this. If you saw it, you might feel like you wanted to do that, but I promise you nobody's doing that. And I've been to Salt Lake City. I've been to Las Vegas. I've been to different places around the country, and I don't see people picketing there either and saying, our fellow United States citizens, people who live in the wealthiest country in the world, they live in these conditions. How do we allow this? Nobody seems upset about it. I don't hear any screaming about it, or how is this possible? We need to provide them better housing. No, in Los Angeles, you got whole cities of tents. And in Houston, in Dallas, they're trying to get rid of the people who live under the interstate bypasses and stuff. They're like, take your tents and your shopping carts and get your stuff out. And they'll move a dump truck in and take their stuff and be like, be gone with you. So they don't seem to be particularly worried about that these people don't have any place to sleep. So how do they explain this? They say, they point to the people themselves, right? They're lazy, they don't care about education, they don't parent well, they have no goals, whatever it is. That, from the dominant perspective, is the nature of minoritized groups and inequalities. I'm not saying you believe that. What I'm saying is, from the dominant perspective, that's kind of the justification. Because if you don't have a justification, you would have to start picketing. You would have to call on your representatives to do something that our fellow United States citizens are living in tents or sleeping on the street, right? So you'd have to do something about it. But if we say, well, it's them, then, well, then we say, well, they don't have good goals. I have good goals, but they don't. So, I guess they like living in a tent or sleeping outdoors, right? We have ways to think about that. Okay, so now we're going to leave the minority or the dominant mainstream group's perspective. We're going to take those glasses off, put a new pair of glasses on. This pair of glasses is from the minoritized group's perspective. Okay, so this is not the mainstream perspective. This is from the minoritized group. So what is the nature of schools and society? Is it seen as fair, open, equal? Maybe you don't know, but I can tell you that a lot of times, not always, but generally speaking, the general perspective from the minoritized perspective is that schools and society are unequal. They are unfair. They are not open. And so you'll hear things like, we have to work twice as hard to get half as far. Maybe you have heard that, maybe you haven't, but it's pretty common. It's a pretty common statement in certain communities. And I think a lot of times, even with people from the mainstream perspective over here, a lot of times deep down, they know. Like there's been different studies and surveys and research efforts where they will ask people like how much they want to be reimbursed if somehow they got changed at birth and they were supposed to be white and they ended up being black or brown, and they want reparations because they know that life is unequal. And so and oftentimes people from this perspective know this very well. You may have heard somebody, I know I've had this situation where I brought my personal computer into the university, and then it was a big desktop computer, and so then I was carrying it out of the university because it was mine. I had a receipt for it. It was mine. It wasn't university property, but I was like, man, I'm glad today's a good day to be white, because I knew that I'm much more likely to be seen as someone who's honest rather than stealing. And so from the minoritized group perspective, often they're aware that they're going to have to act twice as open and kind and twice as polite, so that they don't get seen as angry or rude or lazy. So they often have this stereotype threat that they often are aware of and work under, and are often trying to hold that off. And so they're often aware of that, and they know that schools and society are not. And we have plenty of research on that, where it's like boys will be boys, that saying. But if it's Jamal, who happens to be Black, and David, who happens to be white, we have plenty of documentation that David is going to get more interventions and more assistance to help his behavior be corrected, where Jamal may be immediately or pretty close to immediately seen as, almost like a threatening thug. He's getting ready to full bloom into a thug. So he might be seen as cute when he's tiny, but then the older he gets, the more threatening he's seen. And we see that with little tiny boys who are Black, who get shot and killed because they're seen as dangerous, and that this is that stereotype, that they're not seeing the boy, but they're seeing like the threat of, when I see Black, it means dangerous and bad. And so they're often aware of that. So oftentimes from this perspective here, it's always this kind of monitoring of, I think you're thinking this about me, that I might snatch your purse. That's why you cross to the other side of the elevator or the sidewalk. Or you might think that I want to rape you or something like that, but I don't, but I'm aware that you might think that. And so I'm constantly monitoring, and I know I have to be twice as good to go half as far. So oftentimes from this perspective, the schools and society are not fair. They're not seen as open. They're not seen as equal opportunity. And now to go down here to this quadrant right here, what from this minoritized group perspective here with that pair of glasses, how does this group see minoritized people and groups at school and within society? And this is just so critical. A lot of times they will see themselves in school as being very resilient, very creative, very wily, very smart, very hardworking. And the reason, and what I mean by wily here, even though it shows that it's got spelled wrong, is that, being wily is like, think of the Brer Rabbit stories, where the smaller Brer Rabbit is smaller, but uses his cunning to outsmart the fox, right? And so if you're wily, it's like, even though there's all these inequalities, and I have to walk around and I have to be constantly managing these stereotypes, look at me, I'm still doing it. You keep discriminating against me or having these implicit biases, but I keep achieving anyway. So look how smart I am. Like with Brer Rabbit, one of the stories, he's so resilient and so wily. He outsmarts the bigger fox, because he says, don't throw me into the briar patch, please. If you do anything, you can roast me, you can dip me in the pond, whatever you want to do, but please do not, whatever you do, do not throw me into the briar patch. And so of course then the fox throws him into the briar patch, and Brer Rabbit thinks this is hilarious because he was born in the briar patch, and there's all kinds of prickly things that the fox can't get him. And so he's been very creative, very smart. He's outwitted this bigger opponent. So oftentimes from this minoritized perspective, it's like, you took my land, you took my labor, you put me on the most inhospitable parts of the city or the land or the state, and gave me these virus infected blankets, and not enough to eat, and burned down my school, and killed my leaders, all these, but look at us, really, even during the Civil War, there was still a big contingency of people that wanted to send, and even President Lincoln thought, had this written as well. His personal thought was, let's send blacks back to Africa, and others were like, well, that's not super realistic. They talk to different groups and be like, do you think you can get people, kind of buy into this back to Africa stuff? And it was kind of a thing for a while to talk about that and think about it, but it wasn't really realistic. And so other people were like, well, that's all right. You had kind of the whole movement of eugenics was that Black people were just going to kind of just die out, that they were so sickly and so had such ill health. No looking at like when you work people even during after chattel slavery, and then you have a different form of enslavement, if you will, where people are working in chain gangs, their life expectancy isn't too long. You have people, you have the 100 years of Jim Crow life conditions, you have all these lynchings, so you have less than ideal circumstances to really thrive. So the idea was, these people are not going to live. They're so sickly, they will just die out. And of course they didn't. They not only, anything that is very, very American is actually has Black roots to it. Our music, our sense of style, a lot of our literature, a lot of things that make us uniquely American, you can trace back to, very diverse roots, and particularly the Black influence is clearly there. So not only did they not die, but they actually built, helped to fundamentally, literally built the nation, including the US Capitol. So you can't go anywhere in this United States without finding some evidence of the contribution. So here's this group that has been largely laminated over, but has done all of this excelling and creative, thriving under the most hostile, oppressive, anti-Black conditions. So that's where they recognize that. And there's like this saying, Richard Wright even had a book about it where he went around and took photographs, and the whole idea was like, we are not what we may seem. So all this resiliency, creativity, they didn't share with everybody. So you kind of had to be part of that group to know what it was, but they were very aware of how resilient and creative they were. And you see the same thing with other groups, like the United States has a very anti-Asian history to it that goes far beyond internment camps, although that's a good example of it. So you have a lot of these groups who, under very harsh conditions, they nevertheless produce all this art, all this literature, and build things, make things. So they see from this perspective here, they're very resilient, very creative, very wily, despite all of this oppression. So despite deep oppression and exclusion, they managed to thrive. And so not just survive, but thrive. Okay. So built schools, all kinds of things. So the reason that this is super, super important is because especially for exemplary teaching, a lot of times teachers will come to interactions with students and they will come at it from this perspective over here, that schools and society are open and equal. And so therefore, if we have a lot of inequality, then that means that there's some sort of deficit in the people themselves. And whereas over here on this perspective, they're recognizing their own history, they're recognizing their own resiliency. And if you're coming from this perspective over here, this is very, I want you to really, really key in on this. This is very, the people are being seen as very passive. Okay. So from the dominant perspective, minoritized people are very passive. Over here, it's very active. Okay. So this makes a big difference because, for example, I did a lot of research with transracial adoption, and white parents, they were white parents from Utah who had adopted and were raising Black children. And they often, deeply, deeply loved their Black children. So they didn't necessarily have deficit views of their children themselves, but they had deficit views of the group. They would think, well, I got this child and my child is not lazy, and I'm going to make sure they do care about education, but they would still see the group of Black people that they adopted the child from a deficit perspective. And in fact, some of the parents would do what I call these drive-bys of Blackness. They would have their Black child in the car, and they wanted the children to see other Black people, but not go by them, because they had this fear of Black people, which the Black children then internalized as well. They were Black themselves and afraid of other Black people. And so they would do these drive-bys. You can look at them, but look at them from afar, from safety over here, because the idea was that Black people were very dangerous. So in schools, when we're interacting, a lot of times we're assuming, if we're coming from this dominant perspective, we assume that they don't have books. We assume that they don't have this or that. And it's like, okay, well, that may or may not be true. How do you know that? Did you go there? I hear people, I wish I had even a penny for every time I hear, well, that's how it is in the ghetto. And exactly when have you been to the ghetto is what I always want to say. When was the last time you were in the ghetto? When did you see that? So for you and I, things like having books, obviously I love books. My husband will say, please, could we have groceries instead of books? And I said, well, maybe, if I have to choose between the two, you don't know which way that's going to go, because I love books. We have a lot of books here, but in general, our society doesn't read. So that you might have working class people not, quote, have books. I don't know that that's true. I don't want to presume it. But then also a lot of other groups don't have books either, because that's not something that we do a lot. People read online. If they have anything, they're going to have their phone. So if, so that they don't, quote, have books, that's not necessarily like, oh, they're so impoverished. That is more of a reflection of our society and which way we're going with that, with technology. So the other thing that this is really important with is that teachers are coming from this mainstream perspective, and a lot of times what they do this because they don't know, and our schools have historically been very bad about teaching this. So how teachers would know, I'm not sure, but this has got to be changed. A lot of times the idea is that these groups did nothing, that they're just passive, and they were just apparently just waiting for white people to just set them free. So if I'm thinking about African Americans in the civil rights movement, um, if you think about Black history, and I've done studies on this with the transracial adoption work, where we would just interview white people and say, how do you help your Black child learn to be proud of being Black? And you can put money on it. They will say, well, I teach them about Martin Luther King. I teach them about Rosa Parks. So almost the classic three, it's almost like a trinity. They'll say, they might say Malcolm X. They might, but generally speaking, the three Black people that are widely known in white America would be Dr. King, Martin Luther King Jr., Malcolm X, and Rosa Parks. There you go. Some people might know Muhammad Ali, they might know a few sports characters here and there, but by and large, this idea here from dominant society is that in the United States, white people created everything. We did everything. We said all the important things. So therefore, that's why it's all of our quotes. And particularly if you're a man, white men did everything. They were presidents. They made laws. If you look at our history books, you can see that white men did a ton of stuff. It looks like they're the only people that did it. So apparently, from this perspective, you've just got white people just very busy building a society, building a democracy, doing all this stuff. And bam, Martin Luther King Jr. is born. Finally, he's born. And so Martin Luther King Jr. just pops out of nowhere, and he starts leading a march that says, I have a dream. And so he just apparently just drops out of the sky, and that's Black history for you. And Rosa Parks had tired feet. So apparently during all of these generations from, before 1776 until Martin Luther King and Rosa Parks show up on the scene, apparently nobody was doing anything, right? So it's very passive. So the idea is that gradually Black people were just sitting around going, well, I hope they figure this out. Well, we'll sing some spirituals, hope white people figure it out. Like, this isn't working out well. Like, you said we're about equality and liberty and justice, but I'm here enslaved, so clearly this is a problem. Hope they figured it out. But passive, right? Not really doing anything but singing some spirituals, a few kind of angry Black people every now and again. But suddenly Martin Luther King is born, Rosa Parks gets tired, and suddenly white people finally figure it out and Black people become free. Do you see the problem with that? Like, it's putting people of color in this very passive role as if they did nothing, when in reality, all of this was happening. Martin Luther King himself was the beneficiary of a lot of Black women organizing for a long time. And then the sit-ins and The bus boycotts, those had been tried in other places. And so they were building on what had been done before. So, there were so many slave revolts and things like that, that was why whites would bring the hammer down so violently and so harsh. Here in Alabama, you couldn't get insurance because every time you turned your back, Black people were starting the crops and the buildings on fire. So clearly they were resistant. They were doing things together and individually. Sometimes it was passive resistance. Maybe it was like, some biscuits disappearing. But it wasn't seen as stealing, because it's like, well, if you have my labor, then, those are my biscuits too. You make me stay here and I got to eat. So I'm just disappearing some of your biscuits. Maybe your chicken too. So there was a lot of active stuff here, and it doesn't really make any sense logically if you think about that. Only white people did anything of value and said anything of value. That doesn't even make any sense, right? And so clearly more people did things. There were a ton of people doing and saying things besides Rosa Parks and Harriet Tubman. The day-to-day things that were happening. And this was true actually with other groups too, with indigenous groups, with Asian American groups, with all of the different groups that are in the continuum. They're all actively doing something. And so when you're teaching and exemplary teaching is going on, you are coming from this perspective over here, where you're not assuming that people of color are just passively sitting there, and what you take to be maybe mindless passivity, it may be something very different entirely that you just aren't aware of because you're not from that group and you don't know the history of what people have been doing to change things. So I know here in Alabama, if you go across the bay and you go to the USS Alabama, which was a warship during World War II, and you go through the tour there, like I did with my teacher education students, and we went from the top of the ship until the bottom of the ship and looking for any pictures of Black people. Alabama is actually 22% Black. So we knew that Black people had been in the military and fought for the United States since the Revolutionary War. So we knew that there were soldiers in World War II who were Black that came from our city. And when we looked into the issue of why there were no pictures of Black soldiers, or not even in the kitchen on the ship, and we know for a fact that there were Black soldiers on that ship in real life, come to find out, we found that there was a law in Alabama and in our county that you could not hang pictures of Black people in any public buildings. So you could hang pictures, and they did hang pictures of white people, but not Black people. So there was an institutional effort to erase and make passive all of the activity and the agency that people acted on their environment and actually contributed to it. So, what is the consequences of that? So the people in Alabama and elsewhere in the United States, because the USS Alabama was part of World War II, which is US and world history, the people here were erased from their contributions in this community and contributing to this society. So you can imagine how angry some of the students were, that this is now generations later where they're still seeing that their group and their people's contributions have been erased. And now it's been so many generations that you don't need a law anymore to say no pictures of Black people on the walls, because so many generations have come down that it's just normalized that you don't see Black people in those pictures on the ship. So what are you supposed to do? The people who are the rising generations, they don't know that there was a law that was enacted years before. And if you think it's just Alabama, then you don't know your history. It certainly was in Utah too, where there was explicit effort to ensure second-class citizenship for Indigenous and Latinx people, where the border crossed them, they did not cross the border. Utah Valley was not named for the state of Utah. It was named because that was the homeland of the Utahs. So there's all kinds of things that gets erased over time. And so if we act like that everybody who isn't white was just sitting around and waiting for white people to come to their senses, well, that's a very distorted way of thinking about it. And it's a very distorted way of teaching too, to just think that, people are just waiting for this dominant group to just give them something. You don't have any books, let me give you some books. Well, maybe it's because we have oral traditions, so, we haven't had a lot of reason for that, because your group puts a lot of effort into written history and values that. Well, that's fabulous. But a lot of groups come from a tradition of oral history where they didn't have a lot of access to literacy and writing and so on. And so it doesn't come from the skies to be like, written histories are more privileged and valuable than oral histories. So it's because groups put more emphasis on it. So if we look at, just kind of assuming through a deficit view that poor people or minoritized groups or underserved groups are just passively sitting there doing nothing for themselves, hoping that the mainstream is going to do something, then that's actually very distorted, very disrespectful to all of the struggles that groups have done to contribute to our society and to gain an education and to be participating members of our community over time, even in the face of a great deal of oppression and laws and values and systems that excluded them. So if we're interested in equity in schools, we've got to be able to shift out of a kind of passive deficit view and look at it from the minoritized viewpoint. If I have girls in my class and I know that they're getting socialized to be like, ooh, I can't touch a frog, I'm going to make sure that I work extra hard to make sure that my students who identify as female also have opportunities to develop their skills and knowledge in the STEM fields. Okay, because I want to be sure that I'm looking at it from this perspective over here. So that's what I want you to take away from this, is that this active and passive, that the perspective over on this dominant side here looks at the deficit and passive rather than the active agent. And this side over here is much more of an I thou. Over here, it's much more I it, because let me give you some books. Let me, help you make the Valentine's or whatever it is, because I'm assuming that you don't have it. I'm not acknowledging that there might be somewhere else, some other way to do it, where you're not just simply giving me something, but also acknowledging that I am an active participant and building on what I have already done and maybe my group has already done, to include that. Okay, so that is what I would like to share with you. And thank you for being here today, and thank you for listening. Okay, I'm going to stop the recording.